Namaste to all students. Myself Jayoti and Dr. Khushbu Verma from Faculty of Agriculture and Veterinary Science. Today we are going to discuss about transportation system through cell membrane. So before understanding the types of the transportation, like it is passive transport or active transport, it is requiring any ATP generation or not. First of all, you have to understand about that which kind of a components are involved in the transportation process of plasma membrane. So there are several membrane protein that can be classified on the basis of their functions, like they are catalytic proteins or structural proteins or transport proteins. Means if any protein is involved in a reaction as a catalyst, so they are known as catalytic proteins. If protein is having only structural work, means they are only involved in the making of any kind of a organelle, any kind of a membrane, so they are known as structural proteins. Third type is transport proteins, means if proteins are involved to channel any molecule from outside to the inside or inside to the outside of the cell, so these kind of proteins are known as transport proteins. Now transport proteins, which are responsible for the transportation, it can be subdivided into two portion. First one is the carrier protein and second one is the channel protein. What do you understand by the carrier protein? So carrier proteins may transport the actively and passively, means they are involved in the both type of a transportation process, active transport as well as in the passive transport. They bind to the molecule, and after binding with the molecule, they change their shape to shuttle them across the membrane. On the other hand, channel proteins, they are only involved in the passive transportation, and they have a hydrophilic channel that certain molecules or ions can use as a tunnel. They can't change their structure, and channel proteins are also called aquaporins, which facilitates only the water passage. Means this is the example of the channel protein, and aquaporine is only facilitates the passage of the water. You can one more thing, like here you are understanding that types of the proteins which are involved in the transportation proteins. Carrier protein, they change their structure to shuttle the molecules, and they are involved in the both type of the transportation process. On the other hand, channel protein is only involved in the passive transportation. An example, best example is the aquaporine, which is basically involved in the facilitation of the water passage. Now come to the transportation type. Means transport is is basically going in a single pathway, or it is going in bidirectional, or it is going only completing by only one molecule. So you can understand this concept by this diagram. So here I'm showing the screen where you can simply see, if transported molecule is a single molecule and it is going to transfer with the help of carrier protein, so this direction is known as uniport. If two transportation molecules, one is transported molecule and second one is a co-transport molecule, if they are going in a same direction, they are transporting or they are shuttling in a same direction, so this kind of a transportation is known as symport transport. And if both molecules are going in a opposite direction, transporting in the opposite direction, so this kind of a transportation direction is antipode. And sympode and antipode are known as coupled transport, because in this transportation two molecules are involved, they are going together, that's why it is coupled transport. Now come to the actual types of the transportation. But before understanding the type of the transportation process, you have to understand that which kind of a molecule easily can transfer from the cell membrane, they can across the cell membrane and which kind of a molecule are not able to transfer across the membrane. So if you are talking about the gases like carbon dioxide and oxygen molecule, they can simply transfer across the cell membrane. On the other hand, hydrophobic molecules like benzene, water molecules which are small polar molecules, and ethanol are also easily transferable across the membrane. But on the other hand, larger polar molecules like glucose and charged molecules like amino acids, sodium ion, calcium ion, chloride ion, hydrogen ions are not capable to cross the cell membrane. So they need some kind of a help or supporter to get the transportation across the cell membrane. So there are two types of the transportation. First one is the passive transport and second one is the active transport. Again, passive transport is subdivided into two parts. First one is the simple diffusion and second one is the facilitated diffusion. And in case of a active transport, it is also subdivided into two portion. First one is the primary and second one is the secondary. And what is the basic and main difference in between the passive transport and the active transport? So passive transport do not any kind of a energy requirement, and the molecule move across the membrane according to their concentration gradient, means they will move from their higher concentration to the lower concentration and they will cross the cell membrane. But in case of a active transport, they use the ATP, use the ATP hydrolyzation, because the molecules are going to transfer against their concentration gradient, means they will transport from their lower concentration to the higher concentration. So because this movement is against the transportation, against the concentration gradient, that's why we need the ATP or energy consumption. So this is the basic difference in between active and passive transport. Now come to the detailed information about the passive transportation. As I have already told that substance diffuses down their concentration gradient and reason along with the density of a chemical substance increases or decreases. No work must be done to move substance down the concentration gradient, and the diffusion of a substance across a biological membrane is passive transport because no energy is expended by the cell to make it happen. Here you can understand this transportation process by this concept. Here you can simply see this is the diffusion of one solute. These are the molecules of the dye, and here on the other side only water, and this is the plasma membrane. So molecules of the dye will cross the membrane, and they will move from their higher concentration to the lower concentration, and it will this reaction will be happen till the equilibrium comes out. On the other hand, if you are understanding by the two solutes, so this molecule will move from here to the here, and this purple molecule will move from their higher concentration to the lower concentration, and this reaction will continue till equilibrium gets. So this is how diffusion method happens in passive transport. And in the simple diffusion there is no energy use, and there is no any kind of a involvement of the protein like channel protein or carrier protein, there is no use. And but in case of a facilitated diffusion, so facilitated diffusion is also a part is also a type of the passive transport, but it is aided by the protein. So it is somehow different from the simple diffusion method because in this method proteins are involved, but in case of a simple diffusion there was no any kind of a molecule or any protein was involved. So now come to the facilitated diffusion. So facilitated diffusion like simple diffusion, but it is mediated by the transport proteins. Carrier proteins and channel proteins both are involved in the facilitated diffusion. Carrier protein undergo a subtle change in shape that translocate the solute binding site across the membrane. Best example for the facilitated diffusion is glucose transporter, GLUT, and second type. which is protein which is involved in the facility diffusion is the channel protein. Channel protein provides the corridors that allow a specific molecules or ions to cross the membrane. Channel proteins include aquaporin, which facilitates the diffusion of the water, ion channels, which are also channel proteins that opens or close in the response to a stimulus. Means, for example, like gated channels, so ligand gated channels or voltage gated channels are involved in the facilitated diffusion method. Here you can understand diffusion method by this diagram. Here I am sharing the screen. You can simply see this is a simple diffusion where fat soluble molecules directly through the phosphate lipid bilayer they move from extracellular fluid to the cytoplasm. There is no any kind of a protein involved, and this is a simple diffusion where molecule are transferring from their higher concentration to the lower concentration. They are moving according to their concentration gradient. But in case of a facilitated diffusion, there is two types of the facilitated diffusion. First one is a carrier mediated facilitated diffusion, second one is a channel mediated facilitated diffusion. In carrier mediated facilitated diffusion, carrier proteins will be involved in the transportation of the molecules. These are the lipid insoluble solutes such as sugar and amino acids. So they will firstly bind to the carrier proteins, then these carrier proteins will change their structure and further will open inside the cell, and they will release these molecules. So this is also according to the concentration gradients. Means molecules are moving according to their concentration gradient from their higher concentration to the lower concentration gradient. But channel proteins or carrier proteins are involved. On the other hand, in the channel mediated facilitated diffusion, this is a channel protein which is providing the hydrophilic channel tunnel, and these are the small lipid insoluble solutes which will move from their higher concentration to the lower concentration, and with the help of the channel tunnel. So in these two types, proteins are involved in the diffusion method, but it is facilitated by the carrier or channel protein, and there is no need of the energy consumption in passive transportation. But now come to the major second type, which is active transport. So active transport is different from the passive transport, because in the active transport, molecule move against their concentration gradient. Means they will move from their lower concentration to the higher concentration. That's why it needs the energy consumption. And active transport requires energy, usually in the form of the ATP, and active transport is performed by the specific protein embedded in the membranes. Means carrier proteins are involved in the active transportation, channel proteins are not involved. And active transport is having two types: primary, which is also known as the direct active transport, and second one is the secondary active transport or indirect active transport. So in the primary active transport, it is coupled directly to a metabolic energy source such as hydrolysis of the ATP, and every animal cell maintain lower sodium ion concentration and high potassium ion than surrounding is coupled by the active transport system involves the enzyme sodium potassium ATPase coupled with the breakdown of the ATP. Here you can understand this example by this diagram. Here you can simply see this is a sodium concentration gradient. Means outside of the cell sodium ion concentration will be higher in comparison to the cytoplasm. On the other hand, potassium ion concentrations are higher in inside the cell in comparison to the extracellular region. But this is the channel protein which is basically involved in the movement of the three sodium ions from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. So three sodium ions will move from the cell outside and two potassium ions will come into the cell by this carrier protein. So this is a sodium potassium pump, and because this movement is against the concentration gradient, because already sodium ion concentration is higher in the outside of the cell, and potassium ion concentration is very much higher inside the cell, but still these molecules will move against their concentration gradient. So that's why this carrier protein will also hydrolyze the ATP, and it will convert it into ADP and phosphate group. This release the energy, and this energy is used in the transportation of the three sodium ions and two potassium ions against their concentration gradient. So this is how animal cell maintain the sodium ion concentration lower and potassium ion concentration higher inside the cell. So this sodium potassium pump is involved in maintaining the sodium potassium ion concentration, and you can understand the carrier protein structure changes by this diagram representation. So first of all, three sodium ions will bind to their specific site present in the carrier protein. They will bind, and you can simply see inside the cell cytoplasm, sodium ion concentration low, potassium ion high. In extracellular fluid, sodium ion higher and potassium ion concentration is low. But in carrier protein, again, three sodium ions will bind to the carrier protein. Now ATP will come and it will be hydrolyzed and converted into the ADP, and energy will be generated. This energy will be used to change the conformation of the carrier protein. Now these carrier protein will open their mouth towards the extracellular fluid. Now these three sodium ions will be released into the extracellular fluid. Then two potassium ions from the extracellular fluid will bind to their specific site at the carrier protein. Then this phosphate group, which was already binded, it will be released. When it released, against carrier protein conformation changes, and the mouth will open inside the cell towards the cytoplasm, and now these two potassium ions will be released into cytoplasm. So that's how a carrier protein work in an active transportation process. Now come to the second type, which is of active transportation. This is secondary active transportation. It occurs when endergonic, means uphill transport of one solute, is coupled to the exergonic downhill flow of a different solute that was originally pumped uphill by the primary transport. Best example for the secondary active transport is sodium glucose transport. In this case, already one primary active transportation is happening, by which three sodium ion come out and released into the extracellular matrix, and these sodium ions, two sodium ions from these released three sodium ions, they will couple with the glucose molecules and again will come into the cytoplasm with the help of sodium glucose co-transporter. And this coupled transportation mm, do not need any kind of a ATP hydrolyzation, means they use the indirect ATP consumption, because ATP consumption is happening only in the primary transportation process. So that's how glucose sodium co-transporter use indirectly energy. So that's why it is called secondary active transport. You can understand this example by this diagram, so you will better understand the concept of the secondary active transport. This is the primary active transport, sodium potassium pump, from where three sodium ions are going to release into the extracellular matrix and two potassium ions are coming inside the cell, and ATP is going to hydrolyze and convert it into the ATP and phosphate ions. And now, because of this ATP hydrolysis, this transportation happens. So this is the primary active transport. But from the release three sodium ions, two sodium ions will come along with the glucose molecule, and they will move inside the cell with the help of glucose sodium co-transporter. This transportation do not involve in the direct ATP hydrolysis. They will use indirectly this ATP hydrolysis effect. So that's why it is known as secondary active transport. Now come to the overview about the active transport and about the passive transport. So in the passive transport, there is no need of the energy consumption, because molecules will move according to their concentration gradient from their higher concentration to the lower concentration. And passive transport again divided into two parts. First one is the simple diffusion, second is the facilitated diffusion. In the simple diffusion, only molecule will move across the cell membrane. On the other hand, in the facilitated diffusion, channel proteins and carrier proteins are involved in the transportation process. On the other hand, in the active transportation process, molecule will move against their concentration gradient, means they will move from their lower concentration to their higher concentration, and it requires the carrier proteins and ATP hydrolysis. And active transport again divided into two parts: primary active transport and secondary active transport. So this is the sum up of this session, and this session is powered by digital version 2.0 Jyoti Vidyapeeth Women's University Jaipur. If you have any query, then mention in the comment box. I will resolve it. Thank you.